Welcome back to the Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. I am Stephanie Weidel. Our mission through this podcast is to bring to the attention of every American the fact that there have been, right before our eyes, incredible, unconstitutional, and therefore illegal acts done to our military, federal employees, contractors, and average American citizens. When one looks at the truth of the past almost 4 years in the face, one cannot deny there has been wrongdoing. So some people say, why should it matter now? We're through it. But are we? Over the past couple months, our guests have told their stories of what they experienced, but also what they still see happening. We cannot be on the other side of the problem until we've made a change to fix it. There has been little change, and that is what our organization is actively seeking: reform and incredible accountability so this never happens again, all from the inside out. Use the information provided in these podcasts to go out and stand loudly, ask questions of your supervisors, have conversations with your coworkers and neighbors about the constitutional violations we see. Know your Constitution. Please share these podcasts with those in your sphere. Also, like, comment, and subscribe to our podcast on all platforms where you watch or listen.
Welcome to the Feds, insiders bringing accountability, integrity, and reform to a broken bureaucracy. At Feds for Freedom, we value constructive dissent and healthy debate. The views and opinions shared in today's episode are those of the speaker alone and do not express the views or opinions of the U.S. government or any other employer.
Today, I have the honor of speaking with Commander Robert Green, Jr. of the United States Navy. He has become one of the Navy's most vocal figures in the fight against the unlawful implementation of the military COVID-19 vaccine mandates. He was banned from his building and removed from his position, but he is currently still a commander in a different location and uses his voice and pen to fight for the Constitution. And he encourages all to do the same. He wrote a book, Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines, a story of hope for those who love liberty. We talk at length about what a lawful versus unlawful order is, how the Constitution was defiled, what he saw within his ranks, and what he encourages people to do about it: find each other and stand up. Welcome to the Feds, Rob. It's so good to have you. Thank you for coming on.
Thank you very much for having me.
Why don't you tell us about you and why you joined the Navy?
Okay, thank you for the question. Again, thank you for everything that you and your organization are doing, standing up for truth and freedom. So me, Rob Green, I'm a commander in the United States Navy. I joined the Navy because I wanted to do something important. I wanted to serve my country. I wanted to do something exciting and get out there and see new things. It was a great opportunity to provide and, focus on what's really important in my life, being a husband and a father. So, a great place to be when I started out, United States Navy.
And when did you start?
So I entered the Naval Academy in 2003, and it was commissioned in 2007 and, have been serving in various capacities, for the federal government ever since.
So what did it take to become the high rank of a Navy commander? And what were your duties?
So it takes a lot of perseverance, but most importantly, really good people, teaching you, bringing you along, amazing teams that have worked for me, that have made sure that we executed our missions well. I was a destroyer sailor. I did two tours on destroyers. I did data analytics for the Navy. Actually got out as a lieutenant and was hired as a GS. For
our listeners, what is GS?
So I was a government servant, a government civilian. I was doing data analytics and operational testing for future weapon systems for the Navy. I did that for 5 years, and then I got back in as an active duty doing reserve management. So it was a permanent active duty position. And it was there that I got transferred up to Rhode Island and was the XO of a small boat squadron doing harbor defense. And now I'm back in Virginia, and I'm doing a staff tour right now.
So what does it mean to be a commander?
Well, in the Navy, a commander is a field grade officer. It's a senior officer in the Navy, and it's the lowest ranking of the senior officers. The highest ranking, obviously, being a 4-star admiral, but it is the rank kind of on the front lines of leading individual units. Our smallest our ships, like the destroyers, frigates. Those are led by O5s, by commanders.
And how many people were under you?
It depends. My responsibilities as a very junior officer straight out of the academy, a handful. As the executive officer of the Harbor Security Squadron, we had units all over the world. It was 650 people.
Wow. So what kind of training in the Constitution did you have to do from just entering the Navy or even in high school to becoming a commander? What kind of background in just the Constitution and the laws of this country did you have?
Unfortunately, very little formal training provided by the Navy. A lot of what we stood for and we stand for the Constitution, we understand it through our own research, through actually reading what the words say, and making sure that we are upholding that oath as dictated by law.
So what do you all learn in your education to become high-ranking Navy officials?
As far as constitutional courses, it's very little. I mean, there's a significant amount of training that we go through on leadership, on how to take care of teams, technical things. But I think the last constitutional course I had was at the Naval Academy, and that was a very long time ago.
It seems very odd, because don't you swear an oath to uphold the Constitution?
We do, to support and defend the Constitution. So we definitely need. It's one of the things that many of us who have stood up to what we've seen in recent years as unconstitutionality within our leadership. It's what many of us have been pushing for, ensuring that we are having this proper training, what it means when you take that oath, because you don't just take it the first time when you enter service. You don't just take it when you're commissioned. If you get commissioned as an officer, an enlisted person takes it every time they re-enlist. An officer takes it every time they receive a promotion. So any of the 4-star admirals that you see out there, you see them doing press conferences, or, you see them on the Hill, in testimony before Congress. They have taken that oath dozens of times. They've given that oath many, many more times when they have re-enlisted someone or commissioned someone. So we should understand what the oath to the Constitution means for those in the civil service and those in the military.
That's right. And we're going to be getting to this a little bit later on. So let's go ahead and start talking about what you saw in 2020.
Yeah. So it was a very interesting time. A lot of low information environments going on early in 2020. But we, there was mitigations being put in place by very well-meaning people who wanted to protect service members. At some point, it got out of hand because it got political, and many of the mitigation measures were being used as a way to gauge people's compliance. We saw that all across the government. We saw the government trying to do that to even civilian companies, dictating what mitigation measures they were going to do. Is it are you more than 100 people in your employ? Well, you're going to have to do this. Government one size fits all does not work for individuals when individual rights is what the Constitution is based on.
So you were stationed in Rhode Island at the time. What did you see within your unit in 2020, like March of 2020? And how long did it take you to realize that something was not right?
Oh, it was pretty quick for me. I had an objection to many of the things, especially the vaccine. I also refused to take any COVID test, because, frankly, it was unnecessary. It became punitive in the Navy. If you did not get the vaccine, that was what, they used as, the indication that you were going to have to start testing. And then, the testing was done repeatedly. It was not based on your individual health. It wasn't based on symptoms. It wasn't based on, how much of the unit, what percentage of the unit was vaccinated. They just started mandating COVID-19 diagnostic tests as a punitive measure. And I had one service member who reported to me and actually, wrote about that. One service member reported to me that they were tested 103 times. Forcibly tested 103 times for COVID because he refused the vaccine. And every single one of those tests, every single one of those 103 tests came back negative. It was a waste of time. It was meant to coerce and abuse him because he would not do something that violated his conscience.
Well, and unhealthy for his body because of all of the toxins in those PCR tests. Well, in those nasal swabs, the ethylene oxide and all of that. So, how long did it take you to realize something was up?
Well, so it was, like I said, it was pretty quick. But in terms of what you can do to stand up to it, it's a very tight rope you have to walk, because when somebody's giving an order, the inference of that order is that it's going to be lawful. And the only way to get an order declared unlawful is by a federal judge or by a military judge. And so anybody who disobeys a lawful order, an order that has the inference of lawfulness, takes all the risk on themselves. And so that's the situation we found ourselves in, early in 2021, as mask mandates became widespread and testing started. And then certainly as the vaccine came out, and then testing for the diagnostic testing for COVID became punitive. So, there was some analysis that had to be done.
Let's get a chronological view of what you went through as a Navy commander, when all the COVID measures started. And so in March of 2020, we knew that there was some kind of virus. And so we all were in lockdown. So what did that look for you, where you were, and what did you do about it? What were you asked to do within the Navy?
So we did the usual. So we, did distancing between each other. We rotated teams. We made sure that trainings were done remotely as much as possible. Those all seemed like very reasonable measures, things that we could do without hurting our readiness. So, full support for all that from me and from our team. We did a great job of that, frankly. Nobody at our unit, until the time that I was no longer the XO, we had exactly 0 cases of COVID that occurred because somebody caught it at one of our events or in one of our facilities. So, I feel like our team did a great job of properly utilizing those early mitigation measures.
In the fall of 2020, we knew that a shot was coming out. What were your thoughts on it at the time?
Well, I had some deep concerns. I knew how long it takes for normal vaccines to go through development and testing. It's typically supposed to be 10 to 12 years. And so hearing that this thing is ready 9 months, not just one, but 2 different shots of this, deeply concerning that they're skipping safety trials, that they're rushing things. So we're keeping an eye out, trying to make sure we get our hands on as much data as possible.
So when the shots, so let's go, even before the shots, you saw masking in 2021 and you saw testing. Did you stand up and fight regarding the testing and the masking?
So not initially. I had a good opportunity, being the XO of my unit, that I could set some of the policies and standards myself. And so we held off masking, for every time I had the opportunity to be in charge and dictate the policy there. Because, frankly, we had the space in our facility. We were able to keep people distant from each other in order to minimize any potential risk. So it did not become an issue until much later in 2021, in the fall and the winter of 2021, for me personally, when the ability to dictate policy was taken from me at my level as an 05 as a commander and was elevated up the chain of command. And they told us exactly how we were going to mitigate for our own units. And that's where it became a problem and became less about individualized health and health of individual units. And it became more about compliance with policy.
So we saw this a lot in all of these interviews that I've been doing. We've seen that it's been up to the supervisor. It's been up to the commander to really set the policy. And most of these commanders were very, very strict. They went along with what they were told. They went along with the fear. Why you? Why were you different?
I have to blame my wife on this one. She's kind of read me into health and how we, take care of our family and, and my own, trying to do healthy living. She was the one who identified pretty early on, for me in her own research, how, harmful even the mask was, breathing in, your own, bacterial, stuff for a whole day. People aren't cleaning these things. I mean, I remember early on, I'm kind of a clean person. I don't like germs myself. I never have. And, we have a military gym facility that I would go to, while it was still open, during COVID. And, people would be taking their masks off, just throwing them on the ground, pick them back up and put them on. And, there's tons of geese up there where we work in Rhode Island, right? So people are tramping through the goose stuff and then, walking all over the gym. And, I'm really confused by that because when I go to the gym, I always lay the towel down. I don't put anything directly on the floor. All my stuff goes on the towel. So people are not using the mask right. It was just a sign of compliance. So my wife early on, said, hey, we're not going to participate in this. She never did. Our kids never did. I'll even share this one story. We go to vote in 2020, in Rhode Island. They're pretty strict there. And, I'm not going in there with a mask. So, I'm like, oh, well, maybe I can just mail in my ballot. She turns to me, you coward. So that's my wife. And she has led me to, she's led me to a lot of courage in this area. And so it was her, that really opened my eyes to, not just the health risks that those in leadership were ignoring, but the absolute need for people of courage to stand up and be willing to take the risk for others so that we can try to win back our country to individual liberty as the Constitution lays out.
Yes. That's really funny. It brings back the line, men are the head, but women, the wives, are the neck. It's so true.
Oh, yes, absolutely.
I really have been impressed in this past 3 years, this whole movement of building courage. People not typically rising up and saying anything, but having the courage to stand up to it's almost like to the ultimate. It's the government. It is the people in authority, standing up to them and speaking out. And many, many women, over and over again, the wives have been the ones behind the scenes pushing their husbands in certain directions. I've been very impressed and very encouraged. It's definitely emboldened me. So we know that commanders had wiggle room to push the policies or not to push them as much. But you mentioned, Rob, that later on in 2021, you could no longer you didn't have as much wiggle room, and you were given the policies you were told what to do.
Yes, absolutely.
And had that happened much beforehand?
Not a whole lot. And again, it's how the military is structured. For the most part, historically, we want to push down as far as possible the ability to execute mission and have the tactical freedom, flexibility to for commanders to do what's best for their units in executing a particular mission. So it is part of how the military works, but the same thing for the military justice system. It is individual commanders, as high up as you want to go, up to the 4-star level, the individual commanders who enforce or decide not to enforce certain things with regard to discipline, with regard to following, the Uniform Code of Military Justice. The commanders can't have some leeway, some freedom in how they enforce it, who they take to court martial, what things they hold at a lower level. And so most of that was taken, pretty early, late in 2021, but certainly pretty early and compared to where it should have been.
All right. So how many in your unit went unvaxxed?
I do not have, I don't have those numbers. It was a very small number.
And when were you supposed to get vaccinated?
I think the deadline for me was in November of 2021.
And did you have to put in the same kind of exemption?
I certainly didn't have to do anything, but I elected to because receiving, even though it was against the law to mandate an emergency use product, it was also against my conscience to take that product based on therapeutic proportionality and other reasons. So I did elect to file a request for religious accommodation from taking the COVID-19 vaccine, but that was, very quickly denied, and then my appeal very quickly denied as well.
So what did you see start happening to the Navy personnel who were unvaccinated?
Well, as I mentioned before, they started doing punitive testing. They, in some circles, depending on the commander, if they were very aggressive about it, they were authorizing, absolute abuse, coercion and abuse of service members. In the book, I even tell a story about a young Navy SEAL, named Danny, who, he had come back from a recent deployment and was already done with the Navy. He was like, this is not for me anymore. I want to try to get out. And that's around when the vaccine mandate came out. He said, well, I'm not going to do that either. I'm trying to get out. And so he was isolated. He was refused training opportunities from his team. He was not allowed. So they removed his badge access to his building, with the other Navy SEAL team members, him and a few other Navy SEALs that refused to get vaccinated. And so when they came to their own building, they had to be escorted like they were foreign nationals, untrusted people, to even get into their own spaces. They did everything possible to make, it's basically psychological warfare. They did everything possible to coerce and abuse these people. And tragically, Danny committed suicide, I believe it was September of 2021. It was reported to me later by one of the SEAL team members in his team, that the very last thing that Danny did, before, he took his life was doing basic lawn care maintenance outside the building that he was no longer allowed to enter. So that's the kind of stuff that our leadership was doing to service members when they thought they could get away with it. So that's why we do these kinds of things. That's why even those who are still serving like myself, we do any kind of podcast we can. That's why I wrote the book. That's why I continue to write op-eds and do everything I can, because the truth must be known. This is not how leadership acts. This is not okay. And we're going to put a stop to this as best as we can.
Did you hear of any Navy personnel given the deserter status because they could no longer have access?
So there were a couple people who were very concerned about that, and it was mainly over testing at this point, because one of the policies the Navy instituted was for those who refused to get vaccinated, if you also refused to test, then you were barred access from the buildings, from the facilities that you were supposed to be working in. And so, there were a couple I actually mentioned in the book. There were a couple there. And by the way, I'm not sure if we introduced this first, but, the book is Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines. Came out this past Independence Day. But in the book, I mention, a couple of the people who were barred from their building. One of them was a Navy dentist, a lieutenant, named Lieutenant Chang, and she refused to take the test based on her conscience. They refused to let her in the building. She still showed up to work. She showed up. She stood outside the building in the elements, just trying to get access. And they started threatening her with, hey, we're going to start reporting you, mark you UA. You get a certain number of UAs. That's unauthorized absences. You get a certain number of those. We can mark you down as a deserter. They were doing those kinds of things, threatening those kinds of things. And they even threatened, Lieutenant Chang, with putting her into, mental health evaluations. So she reported to me that she was very scared of being put inside, being institutionalized and forced medicated with stuff that she doesn't want, which is probably dangerous. That kind of stuff was also happening. There's Captain Seth Ritter in the Army. They actually held him against his will for 12 hours inside an Army medical facility. And then one of the doctors, one of the medical people there actually prescribed him several things, for his supposed mental health, against his will. Luckily they never injected him with that, because one of the warnings on the label is that, these things could be very dangerous if mixed. So that kind of stuff. And it's not maybe not on the label, but, in one of the inserts, it lists the dangerous things that can happen from some of these things. So,
they were basically holding him down, about to poison him.
I'm not sure they were holding him down, but he was being ordered to remain there. And so this is the crisis of conscience going on with service members that got very acute for people like Captain Seth Ritter, people like Lieutenant Chang, because you must follow, and I encourage all service members, you must follow all lawful orders. At the same time, you must disobey. You have an obligation to disobey unlawful orders. So there is a crisis of conscience, a crisis of moral decision making that happens when a leader orders somebody to do something that is against their conscience, right? And so it's important. We should take a pause here and talk about the lawfulness of orders.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. So in your book, you explain the differences of a lawful order that you don't agree with versus an unlawful order. And could you give an example of a lawful order that you don't agree with?
Certainly. You're on the battlefield. Maybe you don't have the best picture of what's going on. You're ordered to take a hill. You know that it's going to wipe out you and probably most of your unit. But that's the order. It should not violate your conscience, because you're there, you're bearing arms, you're in the service. You might disagree with it tactically, strategically, but you may not have the best picture of what's going on. And maybe that charge is the thing that's going to turn the tide of the battle. You don't know, but you have an obligation to follow that order, even if you don't agree with it, even if it might cost you your life. And a difference is something that you're ordered to do that violates your conscience. At that point, the order, even if lawfully given, becomes an unlawful order if it violates the conscience, the First Amendment rights, or the statutory rights of the person who receives it. The manual for court-martial for the military is very clear that an order loses the inference of lawfulness if it violates the statutory, that means the law, the statutory rights of the recipient, or the constitutional rights of the recipient. So that means including your First Amendment rights. So for so many people during the COVID mandates, receiving one of these vaccines or taking one of these tests, even putting on a mask, violated their conscience. They had not only a right to stand up and say no, but they had the duty to stand up and say no.
Wow. So this is a really important point because many military personnel and federal employees still hold to the COVID mandates were lawful orders and they should be followed. I mean, someone told me whose husband was within the military, in the Navy. Well, your husband, my husband, should get the shot because he's being told to. So this is, and still people have a hard time understanding, well, this was actually not lawful. So help the audience know how to reach the person who is still thinking like this.
Well, I'm not sure how to say it much more clearly than I already did. It's just to reiterate, if the person receiving an order, if it violates their conscience, their well-formed, conscience, their First Amendment rights, then that order loses the inference of lawfulness. It is no longer a lawful order for that person. Now, that's just an order that otherwise is completely lawful, right? If it's otherwise completely lawful, if the person receiving that order, if it violates their conscience, it becomes unlawful for that person. In the case of the COVID-19 vaccine mandate, the testing mandate and the masking mandates, there was another element of unlawfulness in all three of those cases. It didn't just violate the consciences of those people. Those products were emergency use authorized products. And your audience probably knows this very well already, but it's worth reiterating because those are two different types of unlawfulness. In this case, the vaccine mandate was both, but an emergency use authorized product is one that has not been fully approved by the FDA. And service members were not provided fully FDA approved vaccines throughout all of 2021 when it came, well, through the rest of 2021 when it came out, and 2022 until they allege May 20th. Although there are some indications that there was fraud involved in that. And so, then during that time, they were kicking people out without providing them an opportunity to have the fully licensed product. That is an unlawful order. So in this case, there are two different ways that our leaders, the federal government, broke the law in implementing the COVID-19 vaccine mandate.
Yes. Very, very well said. Your book. Let's talk about your book. So you wrote Defending the Constitution Behind Enemy Lines. What prompted you to write this?
So it was September of 2022, and I had just been given orders. So back to my story a little bit. I had refused to take diagnostic tests. I was banned from my own building. So I would drive to my job. I was ordered not to enter the building by my commander. And so I drove and, worked from outside my car. It was a lot of snow around. So I felt bad for my team, when they had to come out and do business with me. So I ultimately that only lasted about 2 weeks. And finally they said, hey, you can't get in the building, so you can't do your job. So I was fired from being the XO of that 650 person unit. At that point, they did something a little bit different for me than I've heard from almost anyone else. They just sent me home. They sent me home with the only order I was given was, just call in daily and, we'll make sure you're alive. We'll just do a daily check-in with you. So that's what I did for 7 months. And it was very early on. They stopped even taking my call. At this point, the mandate was in full force. They were kicking people out left and right. I was anticipating a court martial or, an involuntary separation board, that kind of thing. But I was, during parts of that period, before I was fired, we had got indications from a insider, a whistleblower, within the Navy Personnel Command that they were doing unlawful things. We got the evidence of that. They were doing unlawful things, in denying the religious accommodation requests. They were denying them in an unlawful way. They actually had a standard operating procedure to auto deny everything. So we had the evidence in black and white. So I was the one who got that evidence from that whistleblower, wrote it up, provided it to federal court. That eventually, 4 days after I was fired, that evidence I provided to federal court won the very first injunction in the military against the COVID-19 vaccine mandate. That happened. I was fired on January 7th. Actually, let's see, it was 4 days before. So the injunction for the Navy SEALs in Texas, that happened on January 3rd or 4th. And then I was fired on January 7th. And so that's kind of the timeline on all that.
Well, so if you're fired, how are you still in the Navy?
So what they did, they fired me from the position. They did not stop paying me. They could not kick me out of the military without either a court martial or a board of inquiry, which is the board that they have before they actually kick an officer out who has over 6 years of service. And so, my thought was they were gearing up for those boards. They were gearing up for a court martial. Then we started winning in court. We got that first injunction for the Navy SEALs. They asked me to write a declaration. The lawyers who were working that case asked me to write a declaration to the court, further expounding upon that evidence that we had provided, that the whistleblower had gotten to me and that I had provided to the court. And then that motion, what I provided, my declaration, was Appendix 1 to the class action request for the Navy. So it became, a couple months later, a class action injunction against kicking out any Navy service member who had filed a religious accommodation to not take the COVID-19 vaccine. So as we started winning in court, I think they really didn't know what to do with me. Another thing that I write in the book is, a couple months before all this, I had initially, looked at that law, done research, got help from some other people who were very knowledgeable about the law, but I had filed complaints against a number of the admirals above me, a 4-star, couple 3-star, or a 3-star and a 2-star admiral, for violations of the UCMJ that they were committing by trying to mandate the emergency use authorized products. Their actions even line up with, the elements required to charge somebody with the crime of mutiny. And so I filed complaints with this kind of language. And so I think they just didn't want to have anything to do with me because it's too much of a mess for them. And I'm not sure. No one has come back and told me. We've never, the Navy and I, and my leaders and I, have never had a discussion to this day about what they were planning to do with me, what they were trying to do with me. I just served my exile, I guess you call it, for 7 months. And at some point they, hurting for people because they've been kicking people out, and the American people said, I don't want to join. So they put me back to work. I got transferred from Rhode Island down to Virginia. And it was during that time, you asked about when I decided to write the book. It was during that time I was going back to a class. It was day one of a course I was going to in preparation for my next job. And I said, you know what? They're putting me back to work, of all people, who has been so aggressive in fighting against these admirals and their own lawlessness. They're putting me back to work. I know what they're going to do. They're going to try to whitewash all of this. They're going to try to just make this go away. Hey, we all made mistakes. And that's what they're going to try to do. So you know what? I'm going to document this so that future generations know exactly what happened and that this will not be lost. And so that was the impetus for me to write the book.
And you do that very well. I will tell the listeners, I don't usually read books like this. because I can't. I don't have a ton of time. And this is the book. But also, usually when I see books like this, it seems a little daunting to get through, but it is so clearly laid out in plain language. You go over the history of the country. You go over the founding fathers, how they pushed back because of the quartering of soldiers in their own homes. Their homes were under almost attack because they were being swarmed by the British. And that got them going. And so what do we have left? It's our bodies. Because they have taken so much else from us. That's what we have left is our own bodies, and we must stand firm. And here at Feds for Freedom, we embolden all people to take a stand for truth, and truth does not need consensus. Truth is truth. You start out your book in chapter 1 with the quote from John Adams. Our Constitution was made only for a moral and religious people. It is wholly inadequate to the government of any other. When I read that, I was like, well, there you go. Well, what hope is there? So you, in your subtitle, you have a story of hope for those who love liberty. So how do we get beyond? We are no longer a moral, our society, our country is not, it was founded, but is not living out the moral and religious principles. So how do we continue?
Yeah. So the hope that I referenced there is about how so many of us who were fighting this, who saw through some of the evil, the corruption, the avarice, right? The greed behind pushing some of these medical products. Those of us who are standing upon principles founded in natural law, we found each other. Like this drove us together. We are now connected, just service members, and you're doing the same thing, an amazing job with federal employees. But just from service members, we're connected to thousands of service members we would not otherwise have known were out there. People who are raising their kids right. They're homeschooling them or sending them to schools in the religions that they believe in, training them to be principled people of moral character. And, and we're finding each other. And there actually been marriages that have come out of some of these groups. And, we've had, there's one group I'm in, and we've had 3, 4, 5 babies born. And every time, they'll make a big announcement. It's, one more patriot to fight for freedom. And so this is what, those in power who are trying to make this an atheistic, government or a Marxist society, whatever they're trying to do. I don't even understand it completely. I just know that it's far from what we were meant to be. And they're probably, they should be at least deeply concerned that they have driven us together. They wanted to isolate us with the lockdowns. They wanted to keep us from communicating through their massive censorship. And we're still dealing with tons of censorship. The book is being censored in almost every place. And so, they're doing everything they can do. But what they did by going too far is they woke up a ton of people and they brought those people together. So that is where the hope resides, is that we are finding each other and we're uniting and we are building, rebuilding, and restoring the values that our culture needs to have. And we hope it sets the right example for the rest of the culture that still seems lost. They're in God's hands. The only thing we can do is be the best that we can be.
Would you recommend the Navy to young people now?
Unfortunately, I can speak for myself and my own kids. No way. Not, I don't want to say not in a million years, but, because maybe there's hope, right? That we can restore the institution. I'm certainly fighting for that right now. It's why I stayed in. I mean, I had an opportunity to get out. I decided, we're going to stay and we're going to fight. We're going to fight for the culture, fight to bring it back, fight to restore us to what we are meant to be. And so I encourage people to be patient with us as we try to clean house. Frankly, we have a lot of deadwood at the top, and I think during World War II, 12 million service members, right? And we were led, I have to go back and look, but I think we were led by 7 4-star admirals and generals. Just 7. 12 million troops over a 2-front war, global war. That's World War II, right? Now we have 2 million service members, and we have failed wars, not 2-front wars, but failed localized wars. We were being led, not by 7, we're being led by 41 4-star admirals and generals. We have a ton of deadwood at the top, and they are frankly I'll say they seem more concerned about their careers than they do about doing the right thing and taking a morally courageous stand. And so, until we can clean house, then I think all Americans should be very concerned about sending their sons and daughters to us. But we're working on it, and I think there's hope for the future.
Rob, I want to ask you the question. I meant to ask this earlier. What incentives do these higher up military personnel have to get these policies through? Like, they're concerned about their careers. Well, who is deciding? Okay, so this person is now enforcing the pronoun policies, so let's get him in a higher ranking. I mean, who is making these decisions, and how do we change those people out who are deciding who's getting further ahead in their career? In my book, there should be further behind in their career.
Yeah. So for those of us who see through it all, it would seem pretty black and white. Part of the problem is what you alluded to at the very beginning of the question along these lines. It's a society. We have voted in, many of our problems over the last several decades. It's not a thing that just started 3 years ago or 4 years ago or 12 years ago. This is a problem that our society has been in a downward spiral since probably the 1960s, maybe before that. We have a problem with the culture, with morality, with people of principle choosing to do the right thing. And so we have voted that way. In many ways, this is probably the natural and just consequence of our own society, leaving, the moral principles establish a natural law behind, right? So, how we fix what these leaders are doing, frankly, it's not just about that next star. Going along with the elected political leaders and their political appointees who are leading the executive branch agencies. It's not just about, cleaning those people. We're going to have to fix society before we can clean that. But in the military, there are some things we can do. These military leaders, it's not just about getting that next star. Yeah, it's a slightly bigger paycheck. It's about them getting board memberships on corporate governance when they're done. It's almost like a revolving door. These people are rolling from high level, executive level jobs within the military, and they're rolling to jobs at, Raytheon and Boeing and Lockheed Martin and, these the military industrial complex sort of places, or they're founding their own firms that are either doing lobbying or consulting or whatever. And it is power politics being done at the highest levels within the military. So these people, if they want to have a chance at raking in some of the money that comes with that, they need to get along and go along with what's going on. If they step out of line, they're not going to get those opportunities. So so for your audience to understand, it's not just about getting the next star. That's a pretty small pay bump. It's about the revolving door between our military leadership and the military industrial complex.
Wow. Well, if the average American citizen can do one thing to combat the corruption that we've talked about today, what would it be?
So I really appreciate the question. To make sure that I can explain to your audience how to properly stand up, there's one thing that they have to understand. It is that we are in the middle of a fifth generation war. And so a fifth generation war is a war for hearts and for minds, right? First generation war were clubs and rocks. Second generation war were Napoleonic forces fighting each other. Third, it becomes mechanized. Fourth, there's some information war going on and it becomes, there's some cyber stuff. Fifth generation war is turning a corner. It's non-kinetic for the most part, but what happens in fifth generation war, it's psychological warfare. And we're seeing it across the globe. Fifth generation war is being waged by governments against their own people. And in a fifth generation war, the individual heart and the individual mind is the strategic objective of the enemy. They want to convince you of something that is false. And then they want to make sure that you project that to other people. They're going to blast you with propaganda. They're going to try to adapt and change your behavior to fit their model of society. So in fifth generation warfare, it's important to know that not only are you, the individual, the heart, the mind, the strategic objective, you are also the ground upon which the battle is fought. If you give in to a lie, if you go along with something, you are ceding ground to the enemy. You are not encouraging your fellow man, the person next to you, to also stand up to the lie. You're further enforcing that lie if you compromise and go along with it. Think what happened with the mask mandate. It was the perfect employment of fifth generation warfare. So many people just put it on because it was easier to do than to get yelled at or have to stand down the department store manager or whatever, right? Fifth generation warfare. So if you want to do one thing to fight back, if you want to do one thing to stand up and not cede ground to the enemy, then you must identify the lies around you and be willing to have the moral courage to not compromise, to not comply, and to live not by lies. That is what I would encourage your audience to do.
That is excellent. Thank you so much, Rob. Thank you for coming on. We really enjoyed having you today.
I'm very honored to be here, and God bless your efforts.